Well then, welcome to episode 51 of Space Rocks Uplink. Mark, what a pleasure it is to see you again. We're 51 episodes and counting, but I'm conscious, as ever, that people may be joining us for the very first time tonight. So what is Space Rocks and why have we gathered in this way?
Space Rocks is a thing that you and I have been doing now since 2018, I think, bringing together scientists, engineers, astronauts on the European Space Agency and wider on that side, but then bringing artists, actors, writers, filmmakers, and musicians to talk about things which we share in common. You know, our fascination with the way the world is and the universe beyond, and how we can use that fascination to understand more about each other, and also hopefully bring a little bit of insight into some of the challenges the world is facing. So it's not all about just looking out there and being fascinated and in awe of the nebulae and the galaxies and the stars, but also by studying those things, either themselves or kind of the meta study, what it means to collaborate and work together, what we can bring to bear on the way the world is.
Indeed, indeed. And it's brought a lot of phenomenal characters together because I guess in some ways we've described it as a bit of a cultural ancestor, but I think it's simply because it does see worlds colliding. And tonight we're seeing two very interesting worlds colliding simply because we don't always deal in the world of literature quite in the same automatic way that we probably do music and other fields. And so tell us a little bit about tonight's guests and why we brought them together tonight.
So the first guest will be familiar probably to many of our viewers who are on social media. And that's Elizabeth Tasker. And Elizabeth is an astrophysicist studying exoplanets, formerly studying galaxies. She's worked in the UK. She's from the UK. She's worked there and in the US. But for the last 10 years has been working in Japan, and currently works for the Japanese Space Agency, the equivalent of ESA, JAXA. And she is active on social media in all sorts of very interesting science ways. Her account is a Girl and Cat, and anybody that follows her will know of the travails of keeping cats in Tokyo. And the other guest is an author from Victoria in Canada. So this evening we're actually trisecting the globe. We've got Elizabeth coming in from +8 hours from London, and our other guest, Ria Voros, coming from -8 hours from London in British Columbia. And she's a young adult book author, and has wrote a book a couple of years ago called The Center of the Universe. And it's not so much about space, despite the title, but it features a character who is interested in astrophysics. And in the course of the book, fictional book, that character meets Elizabeth Tasker. So Ria actually wrote Elizabeth as a real person into the book, had conversations with her, and uses Elizabeth as a sort of a mentor for the one of the protagonists in the book, Grace. And they've actually, Ria and Elizabeth have gone on tour together. They've worked together. And when I was talking to Elizabeth a week or so ago, it suddenly struck me, wouldn't this be great to have her on Uplink? But also, she suggested Ria, and I think that's the sort of the perfect mashup in Space Rocks to bring those two worlds together. Exoplanets, imagined worlds become real, and literature using real astrophysics to inspire imaginary worlds.
Indeed. Without further ado, why don't we bring them in and find out how this planetary collision happened? Okay, just one moment. Ria and Elizabeth are joining now. Hello, both. How you doing? Are you receiving?
We are receiving, I am receiving.
Yes, I am too.
Good to see you both. You've switched around on the screen from the technical check, so no, I'm completely confused who is who. But
it's all good. Well, it's an absolute delight to have you both here. Thank you so much for joining Space Rocks. And we always start with a big, broad question. And so, Ria, I'm going to put you on the spot because I think it's fantastic to have you aboard. Because I've always wondered this: what do you think makes a great character, and how did you meet Elizabeth?
Okay, two questions. All right. I think I'm going to start with the character question because I can nutshell that a little bit. I'm fascinated by people and by characters, so it's really important to me to really delve into the meat of a character. So a good character to me is a complex, flawed, contradictory being doesn't have to be a human. And I just love when there are secrets to be revealed and backstory to be unraveled as we all have. You know, it really is just about how fascinated we all are with each other. And so that's where the whole meat of the character sort of sits for me.
Fantastic. And so how did you guys cross paths? Where did this collaboration come from?
So yeah, this is a good story. I was in about draft 6 of my novel working with my editor, and I had a fictional male astrophysicist. Oh, there it is. Thank you for that little plug there. I have my copy here as well. I had a fictional male astrophysicist in my book, but he wasn't doing what I wanted him to. The character just wasn't working. It was a little flat. You know, I just needed to, you know, revamp that whole sort of part of the book. And I just thought, you know, I think maybe, you know, this could be a female astrophysicist, because, you know, why not? I have a female main character, and I just thought, you know, so I fired the male fictional astrophysicist, got him out of there. And I went around looking for a real female astrophysicist to model or even put into my book, because I thought, you know, why not find a real person? You know, there are probably some fantastic scientists out there who you know, would do well in this story. So I started looking online for people, and Elizabeth's website popped up, and I just thought I would take a chance. And I had actually found her book in the local independent independent bookstore that I go to. And I thought, oh, this is great for research. But then when I looked at, you know, the back matter and read about her and started reading the book, it just seemed too good to be true. It was just wonderful. She seemed like a great fit. So anyway, I emailed her to her website. The subject line was "In search of an astrophysicist for my novel," as you do. And she got back to me right away and was really excited about the idea of being fictionalized in a novel. And we went back and forth a little bit about you know, how I would get details from her so that I could make her as realistic as possible. And, you know, she gave me some background on her childhood and what she does. And I wrote the scenes that she was going to be in, and then I sent them to her to make sure that, you know, they seemed reasonable to her. And then I plugged them in, and that's how it all started.
And so Elizabeth, you know, what was your reaction when you saw that email the first time? You know, I want to talk to you, but I want to fictionalize you. I mean, that's an interesting. It hasn't happened to me. I mean, that must be an interesting moment. I mean, I'm very disappointed, Ria, that you wrote out the flat male astrophysicist and fired him. I can't imagine why. But so Elizabeth, what was it like?
So I'd like to also draw on another point that Ria said, that she prefers flawed characters. So she got rid of her male astrophysicist. I was like, this person, my goodness, they're there. A flawed astrophysicist, this is what I need. It has to be Elizabeth. So until this moment, I was feeling pretty good about it. Now, slightly less so. But no, it was amazing. I mean, I saw the email and I was like, sign me up. This has to be great. I mean, who doesn't want immortality? Well, I'm not sure actually in reality whether I'd like immortality, but in fiction, I'd be like, I could live forever in this book. So I was like, absolutely sign me up. And I was actually pretty flexible about how Ria portrayed me. She had a story to tell. I wasn't a key character. I'm waiting for the spin-off novel for that one where I become the key character. But, you know, I was a plot assist for her. So, you know, she asked me some questions and I gave her answers, but I was really prepared to shrug my shoulders and say, you know, sure, I'd like superpowers, but you do what you have to do. So what I was actually very surprised about is when Ria sent me back the parts where she'd written me in, how much it actually sounded like me. In fact, it was slightly disconcerting because I felt I hadn't provided all that much information. And really, this could have been really taken verbatim from one of my talks and the question and answer afterwards. In particular, near the end, the lead character in Ria's novel is a 17-year-old called Grace. And she goes to one of my talks. And afterwards, she comes up and talks to me because we communicated over email. And she's like, hi, I'm Grace. And I'm like, lovely to meet you. And, you know, Grace is someone who really wants to be an astrophysicist. And she sort of talks to my character about this, and my character gives her honestly slightly cynical advice, which is to say, this is a wonderful goal, but you're 17, keep your options open. And it's not really designed to be cynical. It's basically to say there are so many opportunities. Don't close your mind to other things that might come your way just because you have your heart currently set on being an astrophysicist. There might be something even better out there for you. But it is also true that astrophysics, it's a little bit of an unforgiving career. You sometimes have to, for instance, move around, and there may be other things in your life that mean you don't want to do that. So it's always good to keep an open perspective in case, I don't like to say the sacrifices, but maybe the choices are just not what you want to make. So I was really surprised that Ria nailed this, because I hadn't intentionally been very cynical when I was talking to her. So it was wonderful to see that and see it like represented with relatively little input from me.
Mm. So let me just pick up on that, because of course there is a precursor. I mean, there may be many, but the obvious one in a way is the character Ellie Arroway in Carl Sagan's Contact, played by Jodie Foster in the film, but inspired by Jill Tarter, in the who's one of the key figures in the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. And of course your science field is not a million miles from that, working on exoplanets, and you held it up just beforehand, your book, The Planet Factory. So tell us a little bit about that. I mean, that's not a fictional book, that's about real worlds, but it's also about, in some sense, how we imagine those worlds to be what they are and what they're really not, and how much we layer interpretation. So there's an element of the fictional storytelling that we impose on what we think about exoplanets, isn't there?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say at the moment, especially for planets that might have a rocky surface like that of the Earth, we don't have information about what their surface environment is at the moment. We typically see the size, and we know the amount of sunlight that planet is receiving, but what the surface temperature will be will depend entirely on the atmosphere. So for example, Venus is almost exactly the same size as Earth, has a very similar density, and it does receive a little bit more sunlight than us, like a factor of 2, but its surface temperature averages at about 460 degrees Celsius. It melts lead. And the longest spacecraft has currently survived on the surface is less than 2 hours. So it is maybe a little bit different from surface conditions on Earth, despite having these very similar properties. So because we can't currently go to these exoplanets or land on their surface, we are in the dark about what their surface conditions are really like. So when we speculate on them, we have to make a lot of assumptions. And one of the things I really wanted to bring out in this book was, what do we know so far? What are we going to find out next? But what do we know now? And therefore, what are reasonable assumptions to make? Like, for instance, if the density is very low, that would be an indication you didn't have a rocky surface. Maybe you have a gaseous planet like Neptune, or maybe you have something in between, and an in-between substance might possibly be water, for example. So you could have a much more watery planet than Earth. The Earth by mass is very little water, like less than 0.1%. So if you want to actually start getting an in-between density between rocky and gas, you've got to go up to like 50% water, so massively more watery. And what if hypothetically that was true, what would that then do for the prospects of life? So the book was not designed particularly to focus on individual planets we'd already discovered, but more broadly say, okay, there's a new planet that's been discovered. What is our current understanding likely to be, and what would be reasonable expectations for what we might know, and what would still be out of our reach? And I'm really glad I did this, because I submitted the hardback, and this was January 2017. And I put in, I was like, I'm really, really pleased. I put everything I got into this book, and I consider these case studies, and yeah, it's great. And weeks, just weeks after I submitted the final manuscript, we discovered the TRAPPIST-1 system, which has become one of the most famous planetary systems currently in our repertoire, of these 7 Earth-sized planets. And a lot have been pinned on the excitement of possibly being able to find out what their surfaces are like with future telescopes. And I was like, well, that was always going to happen. But did it really have to be TRAPPIST-1? So it's actually in the paperback version as an addendum at the back, but the main book doesn't consider TRAPPIST-1. But I did try to design the book so that, you have the skills to be able to assess the media articles and to say critically, okay, this statement is reasonable. This statement is maybe a little bit too imaginative, and we probably don't know the details yet.
It's fantastic the parallels, in tonight's conversation. Um, as a foreground to actually chatting tonight, of course, we're talking. I picked up on one thing, the concept of imagining worlds. The idea that there's only so much you can know, and you just have to piece what you do know on sometimes not a complete picture, whatever else. So Ria, I wonder if, flipping back to the literary side of things, had you interacted with many astrophysicists before, and did meeting Elizabeth change any preconceptions you may have had of what astrophysicists are like, or what was that first interaction like?
I guess going back to my poor fired male astrophysicist character, we could probably make an assumption that I had some stereotypical view of of what an astrophysicist might be like. I haven't interacted with that many before meeting Elizabeth, and I was amazed that she and I are actually so similar in our communication styles. We both have similar senses of humor, and all of that was really fascinating for me to sort of experience as somebody who was creating, a character and trying to create someone maybe a little bit more unusual for my readers as well. So that worked out really beautifully. But I think that the last part of your question was, what was it like when we first met? That was really interesting too, because we interacted over email and messages for a long time. It was was it almost a year, Elizabeth? It was a long time, right?
At least that much,
yeah, the book came out, and we sort of went back and forth in the editing process, and then when it came out, but Elizabeth had this amazing idea that we could perhaps do a book tour together, because the paperback version of her book was coming out basically the same time that my hardback book was coming out. And so we organized a tour here in Canada. She flew over and we did several cities across the country, and we could talk more about that if you like. But the meeting was very interesting because we had only interacted, as I said, sort of online, and then we had our meeting, I think it was at the hotel, wasn't it, in Toronto? Mm-hmm. Just down the street from the recording studio, the CTV recording studio, where we were about to go live on national television. So we met about 20 minutes before we had to step onto the stage together. So that was pretty fun.
And how did that work? Because again, stereotypes. The people who might come to a book event linked to science might be different to those who come to a young adult fiction book or a fiction book altogether. For some reason during lockdown, my family, no, they didn't exactly force me, but I sat in front and watched the whole of Jane the Virgin, which I'd never seen before. And of course she's an author, and that whole story about how she gets a book out and goes on tour. They're different audiences, I would say. So how did that come across to the audience? Did you find there was nobody in the room because they didn't know which one they fit, or did it make it actually fuller? Was there more discourse because of the worlds that were crossing?
I would say that one. Yeah, I'll pass that one. Yeah. I would say that sometimes the audience itself didn't change because the venue kind of dictated the audience, and sometimes we managed to pull in both groups simultaneously to the location. So, for example, I would say that we did a talk at the Vancouver Science Centre, and they have talks, as I understand it, quite regularly during their day. So their main audience is who's currently in the museum, and they kind of get sucked in. So that crowd, I would say that was my crowd. These guys were already in a science museum, and, I was waving around a book on planets, and they came in. On the other hand, we also did some talks quite specifically to school groups, and I normally wouldn't be invited to those. I have done some school groups, but normally they've had a science event, and that's why they've pulled me in. Whereas we were speaking in school libraries. So this was very much the YA crowd. And I wasn't worried. Especially because young adults, they're basically adults at that stage. I didn't dub down my talk or anything for them. I was pretty confident they would enjoy it, but I didn't know whether they would really want to be there. Were they sure they could follow, but did they really care? But actually I found, particularly for that group, we got a real mix of questions to both of us, and I really enjoyed that. It wasn't just everyone focusing on Ria and the novel side of it, but people asked both science questions, they asked YA questions, and then they asked these crossover questions quite a lot as well. Things like, how did you meet? What's it like to find yourself in fiction? And also, how do you put science into a fiction book? I mean, you mentioned this idea of these two worlds. And in some ways, we were at cross purposes because Ria was trying to successfully, I hasten to add, write a realistic novel. Like, it wasn't supposed to be science fiction. It wasn't supposed to be futuristic. It was supposed to be genuinely, what is it like as a teenage 17-year-old if your mother goes missing, which is the heart of the story. But a lot of my book is about saying, look, guys, don't get too carried away here. We are speculating a bit, but I want you to realize that these planets might not be Earth-like. So in some ways, Ria was trying to make her book very Earth-like, and I was in my book trying to say, wait a minute, we might not be Earth-like here. So I was really pleased we got these crossover questions where people are interested in sort of both components.
But you mentioned science fiction there, and of course, Alex and I have talked to many science fiction writers, and we've read the books, and to us at least, to some extent, the very best science fiction is that which is the most plausible in the sense that it sets up a slightly alternate universe. It plays with the rules a little bit and says, how would humans react? But that must be true also of regular fiction, right, Ria? That it's about testing people. It's about putting people in circumstances. I mean, it's not, I wouldn't say it's a kitchen sink drama. Nobody really wants to see somebody washing the dishes the whole time, but that's a part of real life. But what else do you do? So how do you build that world around them? Is it, do you have a perspective in advance that you want to go to, or do you let the story tell itself and then find your way to the end of the story?
I would say it depends. Each story can be a little different. With this one in particular, I had a what if, which I believe is what science is based on too. So it's interesting, but it was very much a question in my mind. What if a teenage girl's mother went missing? What if your mother just disappeared? What would happen? What if, she was a celebrity? What if, all of these what ifs led to the next one, and that one, and I found that parallel with science and sort of, hypotheses and stuff so interesting, which is sort of why I think I went to the astrophysics theme in the first place, because it was such an interesting parallel for me. And so that's sort of how it was built, was based on sort of that first initial what if.
And I mean, did you feel that it worked? I mean, would you want to write another book with scientists in? Of course, you shouldn't repeat the trick necessarily, but did it open avenues that might have been closed if the protagonist was a lawyer, for example? I mean, goodness knows how many films I've seen with lawyers in. I haven't seen enough with astrophysicists. That
would have been very boring research. Yeah, no, the research for this book was phenomenal. I just, and what's interesting is I liked science as a kid, in high school, but I was not a science person. Math was always my lowest, sort of my weakest thing. And so I stayed away from anything that had math to do with it. But I loved science. I loved, the environment and thinking about universes and all that sort of stuff. So it has always been an interest of mine, but it just became such a nice fit. And I realized as I was writing it that I think science in some way is always going to be a part of the novels that I write, because I find the parallels are just so striking, and the metaphors that you can create are so natural. And just as a slight aside, the book I'm working on right now is actually about the next megathrust earthquake to hit the west coast of North America. And that is going to have quite a lot of science, not just, geology and things like that, but I'm tapping into some other areas of science that are going to lend themselves to the metaphors and themes that I'm working with. So I think it's always going to be just my jam.
It's a very good jam. And, as just an enthusiast, I'm in no way a specialist. I say that is my experience of astrophysics. It's artists, it's writers, it's creators interpreting that and making it accessible to me. And so, I caught a passage, in our email exchanges before we joined, that which you wrote, Ria. I mean, which I think is so evocative, and it's kind of like the preamble to an actual question. So you wrote of someone in your book, he was a comet, fast and oblivious, coming into others' orbits and then leaving again, always pulled back toward the sun, which I think is such a beautiful way to describe a personality, the kind of people that we've met, and so on. And, so it's actually a question for the astrophysicists in the room. Do you sometimes get so close to the data and the science that perhaps you need to then pull back and perhaps appreciate the beauty? I mean, can you do both things simultaneously? Because, as an outsider, a lot of times I'm just looking for pretty pictures. But in truth, your experience of things is in such close proximity to the actual science producing those images. Do you find that you sometimes have to step back and try and see it in different ways?
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry, Mark, do you want to take that?
No, go ahead.
But yeah, I mean, one of the reasons I enjoy science writing is that it's an excuse to take that step back, as you say, because when you're writing a research paper, it's all about the details, and the details are often, the decimal point or the error bar, which is very important and absolutely needs to go in there. But you sometimes forget that, those numbers, they're planets, their planet properties, their mass, their radius, they could be dictating, whether you have an ocean world or a rocky world or a gas giant. And that's absolutely incredible. And actually, when I was first approached to write my book, my main field was star formation. I was doing simulations of galaxies, and I was looking at how the gas in the clouds eventually collapses down to form a star, and what's the properties of that gas, and can it change the resultant stellar population? So obviously related to planet formation, but like one step removed. And I was in a slightly unusual position because Bloomsbury were looking to start this new science imprint called Sigma Science. And they reached out to scientists who were writing and basically said, do you want to do a book? And I felt, well, that's opportunity knocks. So I said, absolutely. And they said, right, yeah, so you want to write about galaxies? And I said, absolutely not. And I said, I would like to do planets. I've been a long time interested in this. And I would like it to use it as a stepping stone to switch my field to planet formation. But also for exactly the reason that you listed, I wanted to feel the wonder. I wanted to be able to share that. And in some ways with star formation and galaxy formation, I was too caught up in the details. And I was struggling to see what was the big picture and why did we start doing this in the first place?
I fully agree with that. I mean, it's occasionally the best thing to do is to go to another field completely and say, look, I probably have the technical skills to understand this, but I don't presently know what it's all about because I just haven't worked over there. But let me apply the logical rules which have helped me over here. But because I'm a neophyte, I should document along the way, the things I don't know and how you found them out, how you find them out. I think I'm sure I've talked about this on Uplink on previous episodes, but for me, I have this thing called, rather grandiosely called cosmic vertigo, which is occasionally when you suddenly catch yourself realizing that the universe is an awful lot weirder than you think it is as human beings, and an awful lot more visceral than you often think it is as an astronomer studying those weird details. So occasionally they meet in the middle. And an example which I've told before, I'm sure, it was driving to work. I don't usually drive, I'm usually on the bike, but I was driving that day and had the radio on, and there was Mahler, or Bruckner actually, I think, playing. I suddenly had this vision of radio waves permeating the world around me, across the polders, through the trees, across the rivers. And that music was everywhere. By definition, it was in those radio waves, it was encapsulated. But that little box in the front of my car was able to convert that into sound that I could appreciate. But for that half a kilometre or something, all I could see were the radio waves with all sorts of musics, all the different stations as well, not just Bruckner, but everything else that was playing, in essence, anywhere in the world, because those radio waves would extend, at least the long wavelength ones. And then 500 meters later, it was gone, and I sort of felt bereft because I wasn't seeing the universe in that new way anymore. I'm not sure if it was profound or whether I'd had too much coffee on the way just before I come to work, but those are the moments, I think, where you suddenly realize that you know more as a human being, not only as a scientist, if that makes sense. There's a kind of an intangible connection that you've built up. Most of the time, it's not there because you're just too busy doing the work. But occasionally you stand back, and we all feel that. You watch a sunset, you go into the garden and see a dragonfly flying around. Those are the moments where you connect, and in some ways they're more valuable than those moments where you get to the end of an equation and you say, yes, it's density X or it's age Y. In essence, I think those are the things you live for in science, at least for me. I mean, those moments where you somehow just transcend, and they don't last very long, unfortunately. It would be great if we could have them all the time.
So who are the authors who inspired you? obviously we're talking about two different literary genres, but ones that perhaps cross over. I mean, so I mean, who do you think has told stories well? What inspired you to begin, and when did you start writing?
Well, I started writing very young. I considered myself a writer from, I don't know, probably about the age of 9. I wrote a lot of rhyming poetry at that age. And I was an avid reader. I was a bookworm. I was always sitting somewhere with a book. So I think I probably read pretty much everything that I could find at that time. So I don't know whether I had a specific favorite author, but I just read voraciously. And it was just, I don't know, writing was just always, storytelling was always just my way of communicating and understanding the world. I used to tell stories to anyone who would listen. So it was always just sort of, my way of moving through my life in the world. And I've read consistently since then, and I've read a lot of young adult authors, obviously, in the last sort of 10 or 15 years. But also I'm branching out now into adult fiction in terms of my reading, so which is great. So I don't know if I would say I have a favorite author, but John Green was definitely one of my influences early on, starting in YA. And he does a lot of the same sort of throwing in science facts, and everything is very sort of high level and conceptual. And so I really appreciated being able to sort of learn from some of the things he did.
Fantastic. Elizabeth?
Actually, my favorite genre is definitely young adult. And I never really got out of that phase. I do sometimes read adult fiction, but I think for exactly what Mark was talking about, I often find YA is perhaps more confident at being able to explore things that are a little bit different. Sometimes I find a little bit with adult fiction is there's this feeling that the story will be rejected unless it's firmly grounded in our own experiences. Whereas I feel YA has the confidence to say, hey, we're going to have a middle schooler who's going to save the world. And really, who doesn't want to read about a middle schooler who's going to save the world? I mean, everyone does. So I always enjoyed that genre, certainly when I became old enough to enjoy it. So one of my favorite authors as a child was Tamra Pierce. She basically writes in a fantasy medieval world, and she normally has a very strong female lead who just kicks ass every single time. Almost every chapter. It's very satisfying. So I would say that was my favorite genre, and I think it does clip into the science because it is about exploring ideas and saying, okay, what if, like Ria said, what if this happens, and what if this happens, and what if this happens? And I think that's very much the same tack I took with my book, to say, okay, we only have radius and we maybe have mass, but then when we have this in-between density, so okay, what if that's water? What happens then? What does that happen to the geological processes? Oh, maybe they're going to shut down. Well, then what does that mean for life on the surface? So it's a similar story idea, I think, even if it's originally grounded in solid fact.
Fantastic.
So, yeah, let me pick up there, because I failed to actually introduce why I have this picture behind me for the audience. I mean, we talked about it briefly beforehand. This is the Raven, which is a famous trickster character in many of the First Nations peoples' mythologies from the west coast of what's the United States and Canada and Alaska now. And he's stealing the moon and the sun and the stars here. I think the pearls are supposed to be the stars, and then there's the moon and maybe the sun in the background. And there's this fascination, of course. Every culture has an origin story, has a beginning story. How did the world come to be the way that it is? And I suppose, again, that ties together both of your strands, because Elizabeth, you're working on not only how the worlds are, but how do we form them in the first place? How do we get these different kinds of planetary systems and these architectures, these arrangements of planets, which are often very different to the ones that we have in our own solar system? We had Didier Queloz, the discoverer, with his PhD advisor Michel Mayor, of the first exoplanet over 25 years ago now. He was on Uplink a few weeks ago. And it was a revelation. It was a surprise. We just didn't expect planets like that. And equally, origin stories in fiction are often completely different to the ones that we maybe grew up in Western tradition. So I'm just wondering,
Yeah. One thing I always like to say about stories is that what we want is to either learn something new or recognize ourselves in the story, or both. And so and this story in particular, the center of the universe that we're talking about with Elizabeth's character, it really is about figuring out who you are and then figuring out who your loved ones are. And so there's origin stories all over the place in that, right? Where did this 17-year-old Grace, wondering where did she originate from? Not like physically where did she come from, but just sort of how did she become who she is, and how did her mother become who she is, because her mother is this big mystery to her in the book, and she's gone, she disappeared, and then all the questions come up about, well, why did she leave, and who is she really, and why would she do this and this, and what were her secrets and motivations. And so there's an awful lot of questioning that comes in that vein of what makes people tick, and where did these things start, and how is, all of the things that happened in the past, before this character was born, that set all of these things in motion. So I think that the idea of sort of the typical sort of narrative arc of, beginning and middle and end and the origins of things is just in everything, and I love playing with that, and looking at the growth of characters over that arc is just super fascinating and satisfying. And so that's sort of, I try to infuse that, throughout the whole thing, because I think those are the stories that are really satisfying to us.
And it's interesting that, Mark has raised, the concept of origin stories. I mean, in a very different way, I suppose, Elizabeth. I mean, in studying exoplanets, I mean, the implications on how we understand the Earth and its position in the universe, is, I guess, plain to see, right? I mean, at one level, perhaps we understand the rarity of, our planet, and at another, it does make us wonder. I mean, inevitably, are we alone? But I suppose, given what's happening in the world in terms of the climate crisis and the change and all of that, it seems extremely topical, not just because we're in a great moment of discovery, but also because we're asking questions about that. Now, do you address that in your book? Because obviously, Mark and I do talk about it from time to time. This notion that we have a plan B, or indeed a planet B, is that something that you talk about or been addressing?
I think my general message is there is no planet B. What you've got is, at the moment, as I mentioned, we don't really know what the surface of these exoworlds is like. So all we can say is that rocky planets are not rare. But, Venus, as I mentioned, would not be your planet B if you were really heading off this Earth. And even if we discovered later on, and we will get more information about their environments, that there might be a world that's habitable, reaching it would require a multi-generational starship, which is far beyond our capabilities at the moment. I'm not an expert on human spaceflight, but at the moment, our longest stays in space at the International Space Station, and it's fed very directly from Earth. So we're not yet at the stage where we can be completely independent. Now, I think we are moving towards that, but going from maybe a moon base or possibly even a Martian base to something that could travel to an exoplanet and set up a new home, there's a step there that is too big to imagine at the moment. It's not that I don't find it interesting. It's just that I find it so far in the future that what you're talking about is science fiction, not really science you can work on now. And therefore, as a scientist, from the science perspective, I find it a little less interesting. I like problems that I can tackle now and might get, some information, maybe not resolved, but information about over my career. So, I would say in terms of messages, which I do occasionally drop into my writing, is that, there is no planet B. Now, in some ways, that's a slightly ironic statement, because we may have noticed with exoplanets, we tend to call the first exoplanet that we discover around a star planet B. So in that sense, I guess Mercury is planet B, but we're not moving there. So there's no Earth part 2. I think that would maybe be a better way of describing it.
I think, one of the interesting things that comes out of this discussion when we talk and when we, those of us in the science community interface with the public is there is a strong element of wishful thinking about wanting to go to these places. Some of it positive in the sense it's about exploration, investigating new environments, sort of expanding our consciousness. But I wonder, as an outsider to the science field, Ria, whether you have a thought on this. I often feel that it's actually escapism in a negative way as well, saying we've done such a bad job here, let's just go somewhere else and start again because we surely won't get it wrong a second time. Which strikes me as most remarkable hubris imaginable. Certainly when you're starting with a planet that's utterly unsuited to us in the first place, what are the chances? We've managed to damage paradise. What are we going to do with Venus? So I wonder, as an outsider on the science field, if you've actually observed that kind of, I don't know what you would call it, almost sort of manifest destiny. This idea we must escape, it is our role, and we can leave the Earth behind. We don't need it anymore. So what if we've damaged it?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose I've encountered some comments like that, online when you read things, but I definitely don't interact with people like that. So
lucky you, I guess.
Yeah.
But,
No, I live in an area where at least the people that I interact with are very much about trying to maintain and protect the ecosystems that we have, and pretty active in all of the ways that we can work with the environment. But it doesn't surprise me that is some people's escapist fantasy, and I think it is about sort of throwing up of the hands and saying, okay, well, it's let's find another place to go to. I think that's
But there's also this more general sense, I think, a little bit. I mean, I mentioned earlier on that I've watched this TV program. I've watched Loki, which is kind of the Raven in another mythological tradition. I think a lot of us have spent the lockdown kind of just watching TV to sort of escape from the world around us, and that maybe I'm being dystopian, but I wonder whether we are retreating from this world. So I mean, certainly very happy to hear that in British Columbia people are engaging with keeping the world alive. I'm not sure it's happening everywhere though. So Elizabeth, you live in a completely different environment in the middle of urban Tokyo. How is environmentalism there as a movement? Is it ignored completely? I mean, is it just Harajuku girls, or is it
It's a little hard to tell on some scales. I mean, Japan has a very extensive recycling program, but they also burn a huge amount of waste. So we do recycle. Like, I have a different type of trash to take out every day, which when I first arrived was both very confusing, if basically a good idea. And you can get into terrible trouble for taking out the wrong trash on the wrong day as well. So it was actually a fairly terrifying prospect, even getting rid of my garbage. And I put things very, very rarely in landfills here. But we do take out burnable garbage actually twice a week. And one of those days is today, and I must remember to do that. So all our food waste and, the cat's litter and everything like that goes into burnable garbage. And people are also very community minded. Like, you often see people getting together and cleaning the streets, cleaning the riverside. That's a very big movement in Japan, which is absolutely lovely to see. And we don't have trash cans here. It's very rare to see a trash can on the street. People take their garbage home. Whether that really moves into sort of larger scale feelings of eco and being, self-sustainable and energy sources, I'm less sure about that.
I mean, because Japanese culture is famous for a reverence of tradition and the relationship to the land, which is equally so of First Nations people in North America. But again, when you've got a burgeoning number of people, what is the population of Japan now? 150 million, 130 million? There's an awful lot of people on a fairly small space. And I live in the Netherlands, same thing, less people, smaller space though. You sometimes wonder, whether we're parkifying things, right? I mean, making things look green for the sake of having a park, but actually somewhere else there's an industrial estate. We just, put trees up in front of it. I'm guessing the Vancouver area with all of the forests is a bit different there, Ria. I don't know why I'm going down this track. It's just interesting me. It's late. It's after midnight here. I'm having one of those evenings in the Netherlands. But so, yeah, I've been to British Columbia many times, and it is, beautiful there. But is it also a little bit strange? I mean, in the sense of being slightly removed from the real world? Victoria's rather different to Vancouver, in my mind, at least.
Yeah, well, being on Vancouver Island, you do have an islander mentality. You do feel separate from the mainland, that's for sure. But I think the connection to the environment, the connection to our natural resources, and the beauty that is just everywhere here, is really part of being a British Columbian and being a Vancouver Islander. And like I said, there are people of all kinds. I can't generalize for everybody, but definitely the people who I interact with are very much trying to find ways to manage the relationship with the land and take responsibility for things that have happened that need to change, and educating themselves, and ways to, there's lots happening that's moving towards reconciliation in lots of different ways, including with the Indigenous people. Yeah.
And I wonder if, as a writer in young adult fiction, just in terms of, is there perhaps an additional responsibility given the impressionability, if that's a word, of the audience? Is there an added responsibility in how you convey certain ideas and how you deal with certain problems in your fiction?
Yeah, I think so. And I take that quite seriously when I'm sort of planning out a book and thinking about how I want to put ideas out there. I try not to shy away from, difficult topics. I try to explore them and go deep into them. And I also want to, I think about fiction, and I write in first person. So I think about that as a lens, as sort of like, this is where we're looking now. And now we're looking over here. And I have the privilege as the author of directing your view to whatever it is that I want you to see. And so with my audience being a younger audience, and like Elizabeth says, a lot of adults read young adult as well for various reasons. But I think everyone comes to it because of that sense of wonder and loving things, being adventurous and sort of, all over the place, and who knows what's possible. And so I take that as a big responsibility to really try and, have that view set in a compassionate and multifaceted way, so that I can show all aspects that I can, to a person or to a situation. Yeah, I like nuance.
Mm-hmm. I'm picking up on that, Elizabeth. When you write, do you feel it's your job to inform people of facts, as it were, or rather to engage them in the process, that they can then use that methodology, if you like, and apply it to other situations in their life? I mean, this is a constant discussion in science communication, of course. This sort of information deficit idea has gone away. You need to know facts, and once you know the facts, you'll be a better person. That's old school. But you work in science communication for the Japanese Space Agency, JAXA, there, and I'm interested to, if you come from a different culture initially. In email earlier this week, you said, well, actually, the cultural differences aren't that big. But how is that working in the education system and around the public education system or public information system in Japan? How have you found that?
Well, I don't really work in that area. I do international outreach because I'm writing in English. So my audience is not domestic at all, because they want to read it in Japanese quite reasonably, and I cannot produce that at any kind of level. So my audience is really overseas, although my work is sometimes translated into Japanese. So it can hit both audiences. But generally speaking, I try not to put a fact without explaining why, for exactly the same reason. Like, I don't think particularly you should take my word for it. Otherwise, I think that leaves you very vulnerable to fake news. And I think we've seen a lot of that where perhaps, world leaders have maybe not given the best sources for, or, at least not given their reasons for stating why something's the best source. And then you have a choice. Do you believe them because they're in a position of power? Or do you not believe them and do a YouTube hunt? And neither of those are particularly good choices, really. So what I try to do with the science communication is I say, look, I want to tell you this fact, but I'm going to tell you why. So I try really, really hard to bring you along in the process so you come to the same conclusion as me. And then if you reject any of those steps, you know exactly why you're saying no to that fact. And then I think, well, okay, hopefully you've learned something about Jupiter or you've learned something about Venus. But, you know, I hope you've also now got a way of seeing another fact in the media by an article I didn't write, and to say, well, wait a minute, you know, are the same thought processes there? Does this make sense to me? And I hope that applies, you know, to everything, not just science.
Yeah. One of the things where you had recently a great deal of success, so sorry, Alex, is with a Hayabusa2 mission in Japan, which really did capture the imagination around the world, going to an asteroid, picking samples up, dropping little robots on the surface which took their own pictures, and then bringing samples and bringing them back to Earth, landing, people excitedly, oh, look, there's the capsule in the middle of Australia. So that seemed to me, you know, in many ways, an expansion of the way that outreach has been done from Japanese space science. I mean, in a very positive way. I found that to be extremely well done. What was your experience of that? I mean, we talked about it last week, of course. It's a bit of a leading question. You know, encouraging people to be open and transparent and say, this is what's going on. If it fails at this point, it succeeds, you're with us on the journey.
I think that actually always was done by JAXA, but not necessarily in English.
Yeah.
So previous missions have actually always had very, very good domestic outreach. And within Japan, JAXA is extremely well known. And I think, you know, most people on the street could tell you at least some of our missions. I hope so anyway. But the international component has perhaps in the past not been quite as well balanced. So my role on the team was to work with the mission manager to translate that information from Japanese into English and make sure that we had, for instance, parallel Twitter feeds that were putting out not just both Japanese and English, but actually simultaneous Japanese and English. So you didn't get the situation where the Japanese press release would come out and then the English one, if you were lucky, would come out a week later, because that doesn't bring people along with you on the journey. You know, you want them to be every step of the way. And the feedback from that has been wonderful. I mean, we've seen the mission covered in lots of different news sources in Europe and in the States, and that's been great. But you've also seen a great response on the Twitter feed where people have been sharing the tweets and saying, hey, you know, have you seen what Hayabusa2 is doing today? And we try to do it for both the big operations and the little ones. The mission manager, Makoto Yoshikawa, is really passionate about outreach, and he really wanted people to feel that they were in the control room, really. So sure, we did some very big events for the major mission milestones, such as the capsule landing in the Australian desert. But we would also do these live Twitter feeds where we were doing smaller operations. For example, when we were in the vicinity of the asteroid, the spacecraft would drop towards the asteroid surface. And it might be doing that to take some close-up pictures, or it might be a rehearsal for the landing operations. It wasn't going to actually land, but we were going to dive in close and check our altitude measurer was all going okay. And we would tweet this live. So we'd be like, you know, the altitude is currently, you know, 1,000 meters and we're dropping. And, you know, we've succeeded in taking these images, and we would have live uplink. And I think that really gave you a feel of what day-to-day operations were like, and also a sense of immediacy that I certainly really enjoyed it. So I hope other people did too.
Yeah, definitely from my perspective, it was extremely well done. So Alex, I interrupted you on the previous question.
Oh, no, not at all. You know, I'm glad you did, because I think it actually brings this question to relief. Is, you know, it's just, you know, it's a can of worms, perhaps. But how has social media changed each of your respective fields? Because, of course, Elizabeth, I suppose in your sense, I mean, you've talked about facts and so on. The moment you put anything onto social media, you know, there is debate, there is discourse, and there is doubt, and all kinds of different sorts of things because of the way that social media works, which I guess presents a unique challenge as a science communicator. But I wondered if we could shifting to Ria, because I read that you teach college level English and so on. I wonder, I mean, how has social media changed the way people write, the way that people interact, and the way that they say and do things? Because in my field originally, I was, you know, working as a music journalist and then as a magazine editor and so on. And, you know, I found that just almost perpetual textual conversations, you know, because people are literally at their keyboards or tapping on phones nearly all the time, has really changed the way that people converse, particularly young people. So I'm curious of your thoughts there.
Yeah, well, I guess it depends on how detailed you want me to get. Because I do teach, grammar and, the specifics of writing. And I do have fun conversations with some of my students about what a semicolon is, and things, things like that. So yeah, I'm famous for going off on tirades to them this year on Zoom about how comma splices and run-on sentences are just rampant these days. So yeah, definitely it has changed. I think through texting and messaging and just the way that people are conversing. But one little thing that I think is really interesting is I had read somebody, an editor actually having a discussion about whether a period is useful anymore. Yeah, because it was fascinating because I you read that title and I went, I'm was shocked. What are you talking about? But actually, when you read what they were describing, which is that we've probably all experienced sending a text message that is a complete sentence, but there's no period, but it's implied, right? And so this idea of you have this encapsulated little text message that doesn't need a period because you've already ended it. And, we understand the meaning of that, conclusion of that thought. And anyway, so that this editor was just positing that we may be seeing the beginning of the end of the period. It was just a bit of a...
but isn't the point there, I guess, I mean, I'm outraged. I'm going to write a letter to the editor.
Yeah, my blood pressure just
I think we're right. But I mean, it makes sense if it's a 240 character thing. But when you put that one next to that one and you write a book, don't you need the period? You don't need the full stops to separate it out.
Yeah. No, of course. And I would also be very outraged, and I don't think it's going that far. But language changes constantly, as much as we sometimes wish that it didn't. It changes constantly. The rate of change is very quick, especially these days. And so this idea of the period becoming less useful in certain contexts, I think is the beginning of something, right? Who knows what, but it's the beginning of something that is fascinating as well as frustrating for people of a certain age.
I have once or twice. I mean, I'm quite notorious. I mean, you sound like we're kindred spirits. I think I'm the only person I know that sends emails where I actually indent each paragraph when I start the paragraph. I don't know why, but I do. But yes, I found myself occasionally, if you get to 241 characters, I have once or twice sacrificed the final full stop. It has caused me great pain to do it in order to squeeze it into 240, but I've felt it optional rather than editing anywhere else. But,
and the message will still make sense.
Yes, but it'll burn in my heart for years to come. And then that's the real problem, isn't it? It's half of grammar is about, being a pedant. I'm sorry. No, I know. It's horrible, but...
We need to think more like poets. Poets don't, punctuation is wherever it needs to be. So.
True. I would, as you were speaking, I was trying to recall who it was. Somebody wrote a novel on Twitter, didn't they? They actually took a series of tweets and strung them together afterwards. And I can't help thinking it was David Mitchell, the author of Cloud Atlas, and is he put it in a box and he's not going to open it for 100 years? Maybe I'm confusing two different tropes. So it's an unseen novel, although if it was on Twitter, it's been seen. So maybe I'm confusing it with somebody else.
I'm pretty sure there are several Twitter novels. There must be many by now. I don't know. I'm not on Twitter very much anymore, but I'm sure of it. Yeah.
Well, I think I write one a day, more or less. That thing. Don't write threads. Well, how many tweets can I put together in one thread here?
But I mean, to flip it to Elizabeth, I guess we're talking about two things. Just I guess the actual structure and engineering of language, but then also how we communicate things publicly and so on. As someone who's working in the field of outreach, I mean, it's so much more than just reducing things to, I guess something that's understandable to non-specialists. It's also it's putting information out there where suddenly you're open to debate and so on. Has social media has it challenged what you do? Has it enhanced it, or just introduced a whole area of problems that you've not seen before?
Well, first of all, I'd like to state that when I tweet, I use full stops. The periods are still there, guys. I use commas as well. Like, there's no excuse for this behavior.
Semicolons appear in my tweets very frequently.
Yeah. There's no more talk about this lack of grammar. It's upsetting me. But in terms of Twitter, that's my favorite social media. I've used a few others, but I found it the most successful for fast communication and for seeing voices that I don't normally see. And I would say that for me, the eureka moment for Twitter was actually the Rosetta mission. So I was on Twitter before then. I was quite a heavy user, but I was largely talking to my friends on it. I wasn't using it a lot as outreach myself. And then the Rosetta mission, especially the Philae lander, and the whole thing was live. And there was a live video feed, and I was watching this on the internet, which fortunately was at a reasonable hour for Japan, which is quite unusual. But I was also had the Twitter feed going next to it, and I found the combination incredibly useful, because quite often I'd miss something on like the Google Live feed, and I see it confirmed by all my favorite science journalists on Twitter. So I could get people's names, I could get the spelling right, I could get the exact quote because they were sitting in the audience. And sometimes it would come through faster because there was a delay on the internet side. But there was quite a few journalists actually in the room during the Philae landing. So they were tweeting faster than the feed was coming across to me. So that was even more fun. But it meant I got a lot more out of the experience because I got all the details. And I could also look back at the threads afterwards and, find people who I wanted to look up and maybe follow as well on Twitter. And I realized at that point, this is the way to reach people. Like this is unbelievable. It's incredible. And it's not enough to do the live video feed because once it's over, it's over. Like Twitter had a much longer lifetime. People were still tweeting about it weeks later. And that was when I started to use Twitter more seriously as science communication. And for me, I find that there's sort of two areas in which I really love it. If there's a big event going on, I actually love the threads, because it has a huge sense of immediacy that really makes you feel you're there. And because they're short, like you can't be tweeting an hour later. Like you tweet the sentence, it's done. So you just send it out there. If I'm not tweeting about something immediately, then there's an exciting challenge there of trying to pack an entire story into one tweet, because then I know people aren't going to want to bother with a thread. And I also know that Twitter is going to jumble my threads. So even though they're linked, people are going to end up seeing like the middle tweet first, and they may or may not bother to look at the tweet below it. So I try very hard, even on a thread, to make each tweet its own little story. And that is a challenge, I have to say, but it's also an exciting one.
Well, it's funny, if I might just add there. I love how sometimes our conversations go all over the place, but they sometimes frequently go full circle as well. I thought what was so distinctive about the Rosetta missions, of course, was also that the Philae lander was turned into a character. They were turned into people, right? I mean, that was the thing, right, Mark? I mean, just to make them relatable, they were given faces, right? They were given personalities.
It was actually slightly more complicated than that. In fact, Rosetta is a European Space Agency spacecraft, and we owned the Twitter feed for that. And so it tweeted in first person, so it was anthropomorphized. And there was this wonderful moment where it first started doing it was when it woke up after 2.5 years of hibernation in deep space in January 2014, and it did that very geeky computer thing, which is a sort of classic old school, what do you make your computer do when you first write something? It tweeted hello world. And people thought, well, that's amazing. They installed Twitter on the spacecraft. Actually, it was launched 2-3 years before Twitter was even invented. It was a person doing this, of course, from here. But people identify with that anthropomorphization. But the Philae lander actually was run by a completely different outfit. It was run by the German Space Agency, DLR. So there was a lot of coordination and communication between the two people that were doing this to create stories. So in a way, the drama was kind of real because they were separate people and they would communicate and talk and in advance script what would happen at certain moments. But then sometimes things happened which were spontaneous because we didn't know what was going on right then. But I think the facade was kept right to the end in a way which was something we were very firm about, which was that when the spacecraft died, they stopped tweeting. So those accounts have never tweeted again. And that was something we were utterly adamant about, because if it was going to be that storytelling device, these are those spacecraft speaking, I am doing this and I am doing that, how are you feeling? that once they're gone, they're gone. And it was ridiculous in some sense because they had enormous amounts of followers. We could have used them for all sorts of other things, but no, that was the story. And so at the end of 2016, off they went, and they've stayed off forever. And they won't come alive again, even though we still have them, of course, but they won't ever speak again. Sorry, Elizabeth, I know. It's terrible.
And that just hit me in the feels. Isn't that amazing? I mean,
if I just go back to the thing you were talking about, Elizabeth, I was trying to remember exactly. Perhaps the event was when Philae's battery was running out. It had been awake for 3 days, and it landed in this dark place where it couldn't get any power on its solar panels. And we actually invited into the control. Most of the journalists had gone home because they'd covered the initial landing and they had flown away. But a lot of social media people were still there, and we invited them into the control room, so they were literally in front of the screens in real time. And that was why that feed worked so well. But that was incredibly emotional as well, because a spacecraft was dying. I mean, we had created it as an anthropomorphized thing. It was just a box of electronics. I mean, really, seriously, get over yourselves. But we had created a character that had a journey for at least a year, close on, from January 2014 until November. And it was ridiculous, the amount of emotion that was wrapped up in that evening. And I think that's the important thing about storytelling, to bring it back. So, Ria, you must have experienced this. You've created a character. They're just dots on a page, black characters, and then they get killed off, and you feel that you've lost a real person. I mean, do you ever feel a moment of, I don't know, exactly guilt or emotion or attachment to the characters, or are they just plot devices? Yeah, easy come, easy go.
No, I think you have to become attached to them, and I love that story. I didn't realize this about the Rosetta mission, but I love that so much. And that speaks so much to why stories matter, right? It's we live in stories. We understand the world through stories. Narrative is we're built by narrative, right? And so I find that really beautiful, and it lends itself perfectly to, this whole discussion of science and connection between science and fiction, and yeah, making characters is about birthing new people. They just happen to live in my head and then on the page, but they become, thinking, moving, feeling beings too, because that's how humans are wired. And just like those, the robots that everyone became attached to, I mean, there's really no difference, right? That's how our brains are wired. We're wired for that connection.
Yeah. I mean, just one final anecdote in that Elizabeth will know this is that we made a series of cartoons with the characters. So they were not only textual on Twitter, but there were actual cartoons, and in fact there were cuddly toys and all sorts of things. So they became personified that way. But at the very end, the last cartoon was showing Rosetta landing on the same comet that Philae was on. And we had all sorts of letters and messages from people saying, you must land them together. They must be together on the comet for all time. And we knew we weren't doing that in reality. That's not where they were landing. And we actually, we talked about it a lot. Should we land them together to make the story complete so that they can cuddle up forever? But we didn't. We separated them out. And, they are in different locations. They're within eye-line sight in the cartoon. They could, if they were still awake, they could see each other. But we had all sorts of discussions about whether we were killing them or whether they were going to sleep. And that was a responsibility to young children who were 5 years old. It wasn't adults who were rationalizing, yes, these are just anthropomorphizations. Those kids who had grown up with it over a space of 2 years, my goodness, that was a huge responsibility to get the tone of that right. And the team that wrote the scripts for those did an amazing job, I think. I think tonally, they were just about right. Didn't build up expectations or say, don't worry, we'll bring them back to life again. It'll all be great. Facing the death of a pet almost, right? It was a bit like that story in some sense.
Indeed. Well, I have to say, again, isn't it wonderful how this story has come full circle, and it all just makes perfect sense. I have to say, Ria and Elizabeth, what an absolute pleasure it is to have been joined by you tonight to share these important ideas, but also to kind of stumble on a few new ones as well. It's been such a pleasure to have you here, and I'm now going to completely ruin the tone, but sort of hand over to Mark to do the feed. We have a tradition on Space Rocks.
We do indeed, and we established it in the first episode, and I have never been regretting it exactly, but with esteem. With wonderful guests like you, we do it anyway. So we have just this little tradition. We adopt the hand signal from Spock in Star Trek, live long and prosper. And that's for space. And the horns for rocks. So space rocks. So, and it's always a challenge. There you go. Well
Wait a
done.
minute. There we go.
Thank you very much for coming on, both of you. It's been fantastic. And I really hope we have the chance to meet you. I mean, Elizabeth, we've been kind of on and off talking and you know, bouncing in and out of the ether, talking to each other. And Ria, we've met for the first time. It would be a real pleasure to meet you both physically in the future and have you along to one of our events when we go back live and actually have people on stage and audiences and music and sound and readings and all that good stuff.
That would be wonderful.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, and good luck. I mean, Elizabeth, it's the beginning of your day. Remember to put the right bin out. I picked up on that. Alex and I, it's nighttime. Ria, enjoy the rest of your day. You've got us all at a disadvantage. It's still the summer solstice for you. It's gone now for us, the rest of us, I'm afraid.
Very good.
Have a lovely evening.
Yeah, thanks very much. Bye-bye now.
Very good, Mark. Well, there you go. Gosh, you know, I got to say toward the end there, I was actually just reliving Rosetta a little bit and starting to get a little choked up. It's not the first time I've been emotional on Space Rocks, but wow, you know, isn't that crazy?
It is a very strange thing. I mean, you know, we've kind of lent on this crutch a few times, but I think it's because it's a story that resonates, and there is so much detail in the background. And these are the communications aspects. There's so much to talk about, the science and the engineering. And I was speaking to one of my colleagues earlier this week, Elsa Montagnon, of course, who you know, she was on Space Rocks a little earlier last year, speaking about Bepi Colombo, but she was working on Rosetta for a number of years as well, and she was in fact the person that took the decision to press the button and go and land Philae. And we were talking, just, you know, not in public, just talking privately, and we both felt the same thing all over again. It was that special at that time. But it illustrates the power again about storytelling, and I think that's what was great about the episode this evening, speaking to Ria coming from the side of fiction and putting real science in there, and Elizabeth, you know, telling us stories about the way the universe is, but let's not fool ourselves because we want it to be like this. Maybe it isn't like that. And I think that's it's what Space Rocks does. I think it's fantastic.
Indeed, couldn't agree more, Mark. Well, as ever, it's an absolute pleasure to be on this side of 50 episodes, and well, we'll have more for everybody very soon indeed. But for tonight, have a great evening, and it's great to see you.
Yeah, thanks very much. See you soon, Alex. Bye, everybody.
Bye.